Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Tiffany Liu, and with me as always are Kensho Watanabe and William White. This week, we'll start out with an unfinished segment in which we follow up on topics from previous episodes. Then we'll engage in a little programming exercise in honor of a special date this coming week. And finally, we'll talk with composer-pianist Lowell Liebermann about his new album, Personal Demons. But first, we'd like to start with our prelude segment. So, Kensho, what do we have today?
Welcome to today's prelude segment. Before I explain the game, I'd like to welcome our special listener guest, Ellen from Seattle, Washington. Welcome to the show, Ellen.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ellen, tell us what we'll be playing today.
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Classical Chronology.
Okay, here's how this works. I'm going to play clips of 3 pieces from different points in music history that share a common feature. My co-hosts and Ellen don't know what any of the pieces are, but it's their job to put them in chronological order just by listening to them. This week, the 3 pieces are united by the fact that they're all motets.
Motets.
So, why don't we go around the horn and talk about motets, or what little we know about them, Tiffany?
Okay, well, I'll go first because I think I know the least. So, in a very strict sense, a motet is a polyphonic a cappella choral work originally conceived as a short and usually religious text. That's the earliest and strictest definition, although throughout the centuries it has tended to expand.
That's, to me, my understanding is that the difference between a motet and a madrigal, I mean, aside from musical style, is that a madrigal has a secular text and a motet is a sacred text. Ellen, you know much more about this than any of us, so tell us, are we on the right track?
Well, when I think of motets, I first think of Bach's famous motets, like Komm Jesu komm and Jesu meine Freude, those. And some of his are accompanied and some of them aren't. Some of them are a cappella. They're much more elaborate and long than a madrigal, but by the time you get to Bach, I'm sure they've evolved and changed quite a bit, as Tiffany says. So, but yeah, I would agree they're usually liturgical.
Are there later motets? I mean, is it a genre that pretty much disappears after the, we'll say, late Baroque?
I think that the genre got taken up again by the French composers in the early 20th century. So you do have motets by people like Duruflé and Poulenc. So that's maybe a good thing to keep in mind. Who knows what Kensho is up to here.
All right, here we go. Here is clip number 1. Here is clip number 2. Here is clip number 3. All right. Initial thoughts. Ellen, do you want to lead off?
Oh boy. The second one, although it had some kind of crunchy bits in it, I thought still it might have been 16th or 17th century, whereas the other two were 20th century. And between the number 1 and 3, I would really need help chronologizing them.
Yeah, I am very much with Ellen on this. I thought that the numbers 1 and 3 were 20th century, or even number 3 could have been a 21st century composition. You know, the first one, number 1, Maria, that had a lot of crunches in there. That struck me as maybe being part of that canon that we were talking about of early 20th century French motets. And number 3, an O Magnum Mysterium, which I really think I recognize, but I couldn't tell you what it is. I couldn't put my finger on it. But that sounded to me like a pretty contemporary piece, perhaps even as recently as like the last decade. And number 2, yeah, I put that ballpark figure at about 1530, and my random guess is Adrien Villert. What about you, Tiff? How did you come in on this stuff?
There's a bandwagon and I'm hopping on. Although I have to say, I totally agree with the last one being a much more contemporary. I mean, it had something approaching actually kind of romantic harmonic language. Mm-hmm. And the second one being much early version of intricate, basically Renaissance level polyphony. The first one I wasn't quite as certain of to place in recent eras, and it was because the dissonance came from just one note. It came around a couple times, but the note that was happening on was just the raised 4th degree, which doesn't seem that out there to me. In fact, we do know, I mean, like listening sometimes to like Orlando de Lassus, for example, I mean, like there's some whack stuff in in early medieval motets. So I'm not so certain that I could put the first one later. So maybe if we come up with a sort of amalgamation of what you all have said, we end up with our chronology of 2, 1, 3. I think that's where we're sort of hedging towards.
That's what I've landed on. And just a point about the first one, and who knows, maybe I'll be totally wrong about this. I agree that there's some whack stuff that came out of the Renaissance era. But the thing that keyed me into the maybe more contemporary thing is the fullness of the texture. And I felt that there were a lot of octave doublings and a very divisi, but not so much like different parts doing different things.
All right, I'm going to go in order of what I played. So the first excerpt is by Polish composer Henryk Górecki.
Oh.
Motet titled Totus Tuus, Opus 60, and written in 1987.
Ah, this does not bode well. Okay.
The second excerpt was from Carlo Gesualdo, Tristis est anima mea.
Yeah, he's the one that you think of when you say wacky stuff from
Yes, so I picked Gesualdo because he's known for this kind of really clashy harmonies. And this is Tristis est anima mea, published in 1611. And finally, the third excerpt was from Francis Poulenc, O Magnum Mysterium, from Quatre motets pour le temps de Noël.
Yeah.
And it is from 1951.
Wow.
So the order was 2-3-1, not 2-1-3. But I think your observations were absolutely on point. And actually, through this, I've completely fallen in love with these 4 motets from Poulenc. They're just absolutely gorgeous. And actually, the Górecki as well is just kind of unbelievable music. So it was a fun exercise for a string player to explore motet music.
Well, thank you for doing something where I didn't feel totally clueless, which I do on many of your games.
Well, we all feel the same way in all these
yeah,
games,
exactly.
So.
Welcome to our world.
But it's always fun to work as a team, and so thank you so much for joining the team today, Ellen.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. But before we wrap up, we'd like to remind everyone that you too can be cool like Ellen and join us for a game on the GabFest. If you mention your love for the show on social media or in an email to your classically inclined friends, tag or CC us, and you'll be entered for a chance to come on the show and participate in one of our Prelude games. It's a win-win. You get the fun of a musical listening challenge, and more people get to enjoy our wonderful show. And with that, we move on to our first topic. William, what do you have for us?
Each week on the GabFest, we bring you stories from the world of classical music, and we wrap them up into neat little packages of 10 or 15 minutes. But as you can imagine, there's often more to say or threads to follow up on, or parts of our discussion that got left on the cutting room floor. With that in mind, today we've got another of our unfinished segments in which we follow up and flesh out some of our previous segments. So, let's see here. Tiffany, it looks like we're going to start by talking about the Met, which we have...
Our favorite dead horse.
Our favorite dead horse. We've discussed it on at least 3 episodes, I see, number 14, 17, and 20. But tell us what's been going on with the Met since we last covered it.
Yeah, so maybe the most interesting development is that there has begun to be some form of negotiation now between the musicians and the Met management. The musicians have voted to accept a deal that will provide them with paychecks for the first time in just about a year in exchange for returning to the bargaining table. And of course, the company is still seeking the long-term pay cuts of, I think, upwards of 30% that says are needed to survive the pandemic. And of course, in the meantime, this has become kind of a PR disaster for the company in most ways, right? Like, have you guys seen the comments section of the Daily Metropolitan Opera posting?
Every comment section I see with regards to the Met is just a total battlefield.
Dumpster fire,
yeah, it's a dumpster fire. Everybody's getting in there.
Well, and it kind of gets back to something that we had discussed maybe the first time we talked about the Met, which is, are there actually people out there who see this happening and say, we don't care, we just want lovely opera music? And as it turns out, yeah, there are a whole bunch of those in the comments section fighting against those who have, on the other hand, taken it upon themselves to post with basically every single thing the Met airs on its Facebook channel, pay your musicians, right? So every thread now is this total pitched battle between people who say, what, do you really think that a company who isn't paying their musicians should be able to like share their content without any mention of what's happening? And on the other hand, people saying we love beautiful music, should they not be able to share their recordings?
And of course, the great majority of people are not in the comment section at all,
Right.
I mean, who interact with it. So
Right. Yeah, it's the people who feel very strongly about it on either direction.
Right. And there was some even better news for the orchestra musicians of the Met this morning.
Yeah, some of the Met opera orchestra players have been invited to do a joint concert with members of the Dallas Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Fabio Luisi, for a joint concert. I think they're performing Mahler 1. Is that it?
I think there's 2 different programs that they've got.
Okay.
Anyway, that's about the Met. Kensho. It looks like there's maybe not so much an update to a story, but a tangential item from a story.
Yeah, back in February for one of our news roundup segments, we covered a story about organ music accompanying COVID vaccinations at the Salisbury Cathedral in England. Well, here on this side of the pond, cellist Yo-Yo Ma celebrated his 2nd dose of the vaccine recently by playing the cello at Berkshire Community College during his designated 15-minute observation period. There's little clips of this on Facebook, and maybe we can link it on the show notes, where you can see Yo-Yo Ma just chilling during those kind of socially distanced chairs that everybody have to be placed at after their vaccine for observation. And he's just playing, I think he's playing some Ave Maria, and I think he might be playing some Bach as well. And it's nice to see.
Should I bring my violin to the vaccination site when I go?
What would you play?
I don't know, probably some Bach.
I think as penance, you have to play one of the cello suites on your violin.
That's true. Maybe I should bring my viola. They'd kick me out, probably.
Apparently, he and Manny Axe did some pop-up concerts for like healthcare workers and stuff like that back in September. So he's obviously being active in however he can in terms of performing for people in that way. So that's really great to see.
All right. Well, my first bit of follow-up is actually just... It's not like an update of a news story. It's just something that keeps going on in my head. And it's, I guess, a little bit of a plug to go back and listen to this interview again. This is from our episode number 23. Now, we had 2 interviews on that show. One, we had a very flashy interview with the head of the Army Band, who conducted these premieres at the inauguration of Joe Biden. And, that interview got a lot of attention and people love it and it's great. But then we had a much more sort of sober interview with a scholar from Harvard named Michael Tsai-Ui. And we talked about the history and future of the National Endowment for the Arts. I learned so much from that interview, but the thing that I cannot stop thinking about is the fact that he just dropped and didn't really follow up on that the average orchestra in the United States receives $20,000 a year from the National Endowment for the Arts. I just have to underline that because, okay, think about that. Like, that probably funds the portion of the year that the person who wrote the grant worked on writing that grant and nothing else. But Kensho, I remember when we first talked about this, you had I thought, a very intriguing take on that number.
Just why are they even bothering to give money to the orchestras? Shouldn't they give more money to smaller organizations that could do a lot more with the average $20,000?
Yeah.
Sure, it helps to get that money with orchestras, and boy, do we know that orchestras need help. But if you're going to spread the money around, I think there's better ways of doing it, and perhaps, this money could be spent funding much more smaller organizations that are doing a lot of good in the community.
I don't disagree with that, but I actually have served on county level panels for grant awarding before. And it is direly boring. It's pretty excruciating. And again, I don't disagree, Kensho, but the process of finding quality in a sea of mediocrity is very not fun. It is, like everyone is submitting these books of materials, and at the end, it's just like every application process where you're just looking for reasons to throw an application out. And unfortunately, you know that a lot of qualified and probably very community-oriented people who would make a really great contribution to the arts community are getting thrown out, but it's like your volume is just so unbelievably large and the general overall quality so uneven and hard to discern, especially if you're going to have it under the general branch of the arts. Then you're in the position of having to compare somebody who wants to get a group together to perform in a nursing home with a private studio artist who wants money to rent studio space downtown. It's like, get me a list of state orchestras in the whole country and we'll give $20,000 to each of them. Starts to sound pretty dang good after even just a couple days of going through applications like that.
One of the big takeaways from that interview was how could we as artists be better, more civically minded members of our citizenry? And the big piece of advice was to get involved on the county or local level and work on adjudicating grants and stuff like that. So good on you, Tiffany. You're a model citizen here.
After she just said how boring it was.
Well, hey, all the most important things that we can do as citizens in this society are incredibly boring.
That's very true.
Kensho, we've talked about some awards in the past, including the Grammys on episode number 14 and the Victoire de la Musique on episode 26. And we were talking about the nominations in those cases, but of course people have won these awards now. But I have no idea who. I didn't really pay attention, so tell us.
I'm happy to report, Will, that Pacifica Quartet won a Grammy for their album, for Best Chamber Music Album. And that included the Shulamit Ran piece that you loved so much.
Yeah, that was a great piece. Fantastic.
So congratulations to the Pacific Quartet. And the best orchestral performance went to the LA Phil and Gustavo Dudamel with the complete Ives Symphony album that we
had mixed reviews about that.
Weren't so excited about.
You seem to like it.
I thought it was interesting. And we also talked about this piece by Ethel Smythe. Is that
The Prisoners, right?
The Prison, yeah. Ethel Smythe's The Prison. And
did that win?
That won for Best Classical Solo Vocal Album.
Oh, that was so strange, though. That was totally miscategorized. Yeah,
exactly, because it's like an oratorio,
right?
Basically,
yeah.
But it won for Solo Vocal Album. So
well, I'm glad. It's a great piece. I mean, I remember listening to it. It was really cool, but strange choice for that category.
Yeah, I think a lot of our Grammy discussions centered around the fact that these categories are more than imperfect and that these albums get kind of shoved into these categories that they don't really belong in. Lastly, of note is that the Contemporary Classical Composition Grammy went to Christopher Rouse posthumously for his Fifth Symphony.
How about the Victoire de la musique classique?
Victoire de la musique classique. Okay, so again, Quatuor Eben, my beloved quartet, won for their Beethoven album. And Will, I have a little bit of bad news for you in that your beloved Léa Desantres was beaten out by Julie Fuchs for the vocalist award.
Sacré bleu!
And then for the Révélation soliste instrumentale, we had, I think, shared a performance by one Aurélien Genieux.
Right, the percussionist, right?
The percussionist.
Yeah,
and
Tiff
I'm
was big
happy and delighted to report that he won for the Révélation
Oh,
category.
Tiff, very nice. Congratulations.
Hooray, I think.
What kind of money did we have riding on these, by the way?
We should have next year, I guess. And finally, Betsy Jola was the winner for the composition, which we had kind of predicted in a way.
Yeah, I mean, she was the most famous
review.
composer of music that I would never want to listen to. But yeah,
that's some of the highlights of these award ceremonies that we care so much about.
Very nice. Well, let's see. Another organization that we've kept tabs on to a certain extent is the London Symphony Orchestra. We had one of our favorite guests, Richard Bratby, on episode number 21 to talk about Simon Rattle's announcement that he would not be renewing his contract with the London Symphony, which was a bit of a shock to London and British audiences and certainly a disappointment to them because there had been such big hopes. And one of the big hopes was that Sir Simon Rattle would spearhead the construction of a new hall in London. And there had been an area plotted out for the construction of a new hall. It was supposed to be a very glamorous project, but of course, you know, this is the flip side of having a lot of government funding for cultural projects in a country, is that the politicians can pull the plug. And that's what they did. So there were a lot of suspicions when Simon Rattle left that there were maybe two big reasons. One was Brexit, the fact that he was still living in Germany, that was going to kind of make his life back and forth a bit of a pain in the neck. And the other was, it seemed like, okay, well, the writing is on the wall here that this new hall in London is not going to get built. And it was reported by the New York Times a couple months ago that the plans for this hall have indeed been scrapped. So that is gone. Now, the other big thing that we talked about with Richard was a bit of speculation. You know, it's kind of fun to play these games when there's a notable spot to be filled in the world of classical music. Who would end up taking the crown of the London Symphony Orchestra? And it was nobody that we guessed because it has now been announced on March 30th. It was announced that Antonio Pappano would be the new conductor of the London Symphony Orchestra. You guys have any reactions to that bit of news?
He's one of those conductors that is, you know, extremely celebrated, and everybody seems to have a very high opinion of him. I've never gotten to see him work, but I do enjoy his opera work. So what I was going to say is that he's mostly known for opera, and so it'll be interesting to see how he will take the reins of a symphony orchestra and how he programs and how he takes that over from Simon Rattle.
All right, so we've got one more topic here, and it's Tiffany, and it's what we all really want to know is... what's going on with the hurdy-gurdy? Have you finished it? Can you play it? Tell us. Give us the necessary hurdy-gurdy update here.
Yeah, the necessary hurdy-gurdy update is that I did finish it, and it does look pretty. In fact, we'll throw a photo or two up on our social medias. But unfortunately. Okay, well, I'll start with the good thing.
Yeah, there's a tragedy, story that is attached to this. So
okay, so what actually happened was literally on the last step, which is tuning the thing. I had it all strung up. I was just tightening the pegs, but there was a critical axle in one of the tuning mechanism gears that twisted apart to splinters as I was doing the final tune on the final string. And so there are two strings here on this hurdy-gurdy. I had already tightened up the one string, which is what you hear. Let me see if I can get it to produce any sort of actual pitch here. I haven't rosined it in a while since I figured that it was not.
Oh no!
Anyway, that's one of the strings, and then the other one is, eternally loosened because I cannot use the tuning mechanism to tighten it. And unfortunately, it is also the string that would change pitches were I to manipulate the keys, which are functional, and would bend or change the pitch if the string was tautened, which it's not. So all I can show you is the drone string, which, functions better than, frankly, it has any right to do. And, the thing is a lovely backdrop now for all of my Zoom meetings. So UGears was so good about so many things. They provide extras for so many of the more fragile parts and, really good instructions for what to do if X, Y, and Z happens. But unfortunately, even if I had a replacement for this one part that broke, to get it in where it's supposed to be would involve a probably destructive level of disassembly at this point. As with a lot of models, when you put it together the way it's supposed to be, it ain't coming apart. So, now it's beautiful, I have to say. And I kind of, it did scratch my craft itch for a long time. Like, it was really fun to put together, I have to say.
Yeah, I think that the key is never to play it. That's not oral evidence of the success that this was in your life.
It does look great.
It looks great, yeah. All right, everybody, that is the end of this unfinished segment. But listeners, if there are other topics that we have discussed that you would like updates on or would like to hear more discussion or that you would like to tell us what you think about, please write in to classicalgabfest@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, it's time to move on to our next topic. Tiffany, what do we have?
Okay, listeners. By now you know that we like to decide our topics with an eye on the calendar. Well, this coming Tuesday, just a few days after this episode drops, is April 20th, or as has become known in common parlance, 420, a number especially associated with a marijuana culture, also known as weed, herb, pot, grass, bud, ganja, Mary Jane, and any number of very hip slang terms. What, you ask, does that have to do with classical music? Well, maybe more than you think. As will surprise only the most innocent of our listeners, composers and music appreciators alike have a long history of combining their art with the enjoyment of various substances. Now, with marijuana legalization a reality in several states, the possibility of bringing those two appreciations together outside the bounds of one's living room is an interesting thing to think about. For instance, the Colorado Symphony Orchestra celebrated Colorado's legalization legislation with a set of concerts in 2014 called Classically Cannabis, the High Note series.
Someone tried so hard.
I know. Well, let's take it back just a step first. What music is out there that either takes its inspiration from the fertile fields of grass? And on the other side, what music is the sort of music that we might want to listen to while high? Let's get into it.
Hypothetically, of course.
Hypothetically, of course. Any initial reactions to either of those sides of the question?
I don't know if this is related directly to cannabis, but if we're talking about the relationship between classical music and drugs, let's say, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, Hector Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique. It's the one that everybody talks about, right? It's this kind of opium-fueled, hallucinations,
fever dream,
and blah, 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 fever dream. I think that's where everybody would probably go, but there's actually some other music as well.
And might I say that marijuana falls under many different categorizations of drugs, but opiate, it does not fall under. It can be classified as a depressant and what's the other thing?
Stimulant.
A stimulant, a depressant, or even a hallucinogen in some ways.
Yes.
But opiate, it does not fall under. So
yeah, but it's a good point, Kensho, that, because classical music is by and large a 19th century thing, opium was the big drug back then. Or, maybe what's that stuff that they drink at the Moulin Rouge?
Absinthe?
Absinthe, yeah. I mean, those are, very much like 19th century vices. But there have definitely been 20th century composers like minimalists, Terry Riley, Philip Glass, who have been more into smoking the ganj. So it does cut across our history.
Incidentally, in a recent Reddit thread in which the original poster opened up the floor to ask for works that one might especially appreciate while under the influence of cannabis, minimalist music of the 20th century came up very high on the popularity list, and in particular, Terry Riley.
No surprise. Terry Riley, didn't he live in a cave for about 10 years in the middle of California?
Yeah, and I don't think that weed was the only thing that he was hitting back then.
No.
Because there's a whole slew of composers also that, basically just dipped acid or done LSD to kind of enhance their
creativity,
processes.
maybe even synesthesia,
Yes.
those things.
Sure.
So,
well, we all like to kind of peek behind the creative curtain and see what is happening there. But let's talk about a little bit from the appreciator's side. Why might some music lend itself more to a high listening experience than other music? I mean, for instance, why does minimalism, and one of the other trends that started to happen on this Reddit thread was impressionist music was very highly ranked in this. What's there that makes it a heightened experience, so to speak?
well, just based on that, I mean, Impressionism, if we talk about kind of colors and shades and kind of non-concrete shapes, let's say, or, non-defined shapes, I think that can lend itself toward that. And also minimalism, I think it's kind of repeated patterns, perhaps, that make you can kind of just zone out to and vibe with.
There's a trance state.
Yes.
Yeah, I think a big part of at least my limited interaction with this drug is just the dilation of time and how that impacts listening to music. And I'm trying to imagine on the flip side, what kind of music would I really not want to listen to while under the influence? Any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, I don't think anybody would think I want to listen to a Tchaikovsky symphony or something really active.
Right. Tchaikovsky has no chill. Precisely zero.
What about classical era music, really kind of, Eine Kleine?
There's a lot of people who use weed as just an enhancement of whatever they're doing in their day. I know eye bankers who microdose marijuana and LSD and stuff, and they just like to have, everything that they're doing, everything they're listening to, everything they're reading or watching, just lifted a little bit. So, if Eine Kleine is good to listen to normal, then it's better to listen to when you're high.
Upon the premiere of the CSO, the Colorado Symphony concert that I was referencing earlier, the finale to that concert series was a concert at Red Rocks, and it was attended by a writer named Chris Walker, who wrote a review afterwards called "Could Weed Be Your Gateway into Classical Music?" And I just wanted to read part of what he wrote here because I think it's quite lovely. It's really see for yourself. He writes, "The orchestra's sound is relentless, turning me into jello, so rich and layered that I can't take it. It seems so much more dense than the reggae or rock or hip-hop I'd normally listen to in such a state. Let me tell you, classical music is some intense shit." By the time the orchestra finishes with Ravel's Bolero, both Rachel and I are sorry the show was over. "Wait, that's it?" she asks. "It seemed like the longest and shortest show of our lives." And he continues on in this review to say, in the car afterwards, a few days later, he decided he was going to listen to some Mozart, and he said, "You know what? That was nice. I think I'll do it again." So what do you think of this? The idea that, we might really have something here in terms of amplifying an experience so that people can see that it is some intense shit, as it says, or more dense than the music we would otherwise listen to.
In a way, I think this drug puts you in the best state to experience classical music as it is being presented to this day, in terms of this kind of implicit assumption that the listener is completely passive while the performance is happening. Where if you're going to a concert, like a band or whatever, pop concert, and you're singing along to the songs, you're dancing, you're actively engaging in the music. And perhaps this is an indictment of what we do, not a celebration, but the fact that it puts the list, for the audience to be in that state of okay, we're just gonna let the experience of listening to this music
completely sedated.
Right, because I don't think anybody, at least to this day, the classical music live concert listening experience does not encourage people to get up and dance or participate in the performance. So I can see how this would be a good gateway into that music in some ways.
Well, and what I appreciate about this is that so many of these marketing ploys that we use to entice listeners generally are trying to pull people in using things that have nothing to do with music. Use of cannabis or weed as at least a effort to heighten the sensory experience. And what is listening to music if not a sensory experience? I mean, I'm always very gratified when my cousin, for example, who attended a live orchestral concert for the first time in a long time, sometime last year, described the experience as physical, as if the sound was impacting him physical. And he wasn't even high when he went to it. So,
and look, what happens at your average orchestral concert is everybody goes to the lobby and has a glass of wine during the intermission, you know? So, I mean, why should this be any different than that?
That's true. Maybe we need to install dispensaries in all of our concert lobbies.
Maybe we do.
Okay. Well, listeners, we thought we would make this a fun little mini programming discussion. If you all had to program your own weed-themed or weed appreciators concert, what do you think would be on it?
Okay, well, it will surprise nobody that me, the old person here, and also the teetotaling vegan ascetic, has gone not for the experiential, like body high enjoyment route, but is taking the more historical version
themed
of this.
concert.
Yeah, the themed concert. I have started with a piece called Hashish by a Russian composer named Lyapunov, and maybe you guys came across this in your research as well. You know, the first time I listened to it, I just thought, okay, this is second-rate Borodin or Rimsky-Korsakov, and in a way it is, but there's also more going on.
Then you got high?
I found that there was more to it. Let's just put it that way.
Will can induce his own high. He doesn't need assistance.
I mean, music is my high, you know? Truly
vomit.
at this point in my life.
Continue.
I know. This is what happens when you're 37 years old. So good luck, guys. So that's the first piece on my program. Then my second piece is a song cycle by Francis Poulenc called Banalité. The text is by Guillaume Apollinaire. The title of the one song is called Hôtel. My room is shaped like a cage. The sun slips its arm through the window. But I, who want to smoke to make mirages, I light my cigarette on daylight's fire. I do not want to work. I want to smoke. And then I'm finishing my program. My second half is with Debussy's Iberia. And the second movement there is called Les Parfums de la Nuit, the perfumes of the night. And let me tell you something. When I used to live in Portland, Oregon, marijuana smoke was definitely one of the parfums de la nuit. In fact, it was very frequently one of the parfums du jour. And one of the funniest things that ever happened to me when I was living there was I used to go to the symphony all the time because one of my best friends there played in the orchestra. And one night, he and I were actually walking back to our neighborhood from the symphony hall. And we were walking by just a regular apartment building on some block, and there was a guy just sort of leaning in the door frame, smoking a joint. And there was a guy walking in front of us, probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 yards. And the guy who was leaning out of the door frame, just as that other guy was walking by, just passed him the joint. You know, I mean, these were total strangers. And the guy, you know, in walking in front of us just took it, and he took a puff. And then he turned around and gave it to us. So, you know, the rest of the Debussy Iberia, like the Matin d'une journée de fête, I believe it's called, the third movement, totally no chill. Does not have that same like mood music thing, you know, of the second movement. But this is my concert, and I love this piece, and that's what I want to listen to.
You're gonna harsh everyone's vibe at the end of the
totally.
concert? Really?
This is not a this is not a Toker's concert at all. And then my encore is Johann Strauss Jr. Die Wahrsagerin, the Truth Teller, Opus 420.
Oh. Lots of thematic connections there. Interesting.
Yeah, what about you guys? How did you take this programming exercise?
I went for maybe the hypothetical listener angle. So I was like, okay, what do I want to listen to? And, you know, I've said this, I think, as we were discussing this subject, the first piece that comes to mind is John Luther Adams' Become Ocean.
Explain why.
Because it's a 45-minute piece that shouldn't be 45 minutes long. And I think the dilation of time and also the fact that there are these repeated patterns and it's much more about textures and soundscapes than melodies, let's say, or any kind of thematic development. I actually like the piece. I just think that it's too long. So, in this way, I think it will take everyone on that journey. So that's a 45-minute chunk of my program. And then to start the program, I thought, okay, I was going to go on that kind of minimalist kind of pattern recognition vibe, but didn't want to go too far out. And so what I came up with is actually Jean Sibelius' Night Ride and Sunrise, which is very minimalist. And also the title is a little bit like Night Ride, preparing for the journey, blah, blah, blah. So that's where I went. And then for some reason, I felt like the middle piece should be with a singer of some sort. I don't know. There's something about the human voice, perhaps, that I was intrigued by. And so I was thinking about what interesting piece, and I thought maybe even the Cantilupe, Jean Dauvin, or something like that. But actually, I came across this really cool piece by Boslav Martinu called Magic Nights.
Oh.
And I just thought that was too perfect.
That's for the mushroom concert.
Yeah, well, it can be a mix. All users are invited.
You'll allow
to,
it. You'll allow shroom trippers into your concert. That's very generous.
Why not?
Of you. What about you, Tiffany?
Well, listeners, I didn't do a full-on programming exercise here, so I didn't do my homework quite properly. And it was because I was...
You gave us homework and then you didn't do it yourself?
Yeah, that's a privilege that you have as a teacher sometimes. So I will say that I kind of loosely developed two different concepts. And actually, I had planned on introducing these in the reverse order, but Kensho, something that you've just said makes me want to talk about this one first, which is that I would love to have a concert full of all the movements that I normally think are way too long. Like, I'm thinking about the second movement of Beethoven's 6. I'm thinking about the third movement of Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique. All those movements that I just please let it be over. And I just want to see what it's like. I want a full program of just those things. And then the other thought that I had that I thought was an important programming concept is I want whatever concert that I'm listening to when I'm high to be surround sound. I want a choir behind me. I want a brass fanfare to come from my left. I want singers that are like sitting next to me. That's what I want. And so I can imagine a number of pieces that I think would work pretty well this way with the kind of pieced out. I mean, I'm not gonna, Pines of Rome is a little bit too much for this case, as cool as it would be to have brass behind you. But that's, that's a thought, the last movement of Pines of Rome. I also thought, for some distributed singing, some sort of Gregorian chant would be really important to me. Hildegard von Bingen, have that coming from around you. I think that would be awesome. I think some of the slow portion of Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe with the wordless choir would be very, very cool. Not the orgy at the end necessarily, but, like the sunrise portion, right? I think that it would be pretty awesome to have Ives' Unanswered Question in there somewhere with the flutes and the trumpet coming from somewhere around you and this wash of string instruments. And I will also throw in there the first movement of Beethoven 9, which has a very cosmic feel to me. I don't know whether that's just like a very individual take, but I have it's a primordial soup to me, that movement. This is not in any particular order. And then the last thing I'll just throw in there, just because it is so strongly redolent of like this haze in the air kind of feel, and it's not an orchestral work. It's the very first movement of Ravel's Piano Trio. I want to hear that high. So those are my programming thoughts. Okay, good stuff, everybody. Listeners, we want to hear what you would program on your 420 concert. So with that, let's conclude this segment and go on to our third topic of the day.
Lowell Liebermann is one of the most frequently performed American composers today. His commissions include works for the Philadelphia Orchestra, the Emerson Quartet, and flutist Sir James Galway. He counts 4 symphonies, 5 string quartets, and 2 full-length operas among his works, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. His opus count reaches well into the 130s at this point. He was formerly the head of the composition department at the Mannes School of Music of the New School, where he founded the Mannes American Composers Ensemble. Surprising, then, for us to hear that on February 5th, Steinway & Sons released Liebermann's debut solo piano album entitled Personal Demons. The album pairs works that have haunted and captivated Liebermann throughout his career with his own compositions that hold a special significance for him. We are delighted to be joined by Lowell this week to talk about his personal demons. Lowell, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you.
So first of all, happy 60th birthday. That's a big milestone.
Oh God, that's something I'd rather not be reminded of. You know, Oscar Wilde said something that's so true. The tragedy of growing old is not that one is old, it's that one stays forever young. And, you know, it's really difficult because I think I don't feel any differently about myself than, you know, let's say when I was a student graduating from Juilliard. So you feel young and you have to remind yourself every now and then that, wait a second, you're an old man. You know?
Well, it's certainly significant also that, you know, you are putting out a debut solo piano album at an age where most debut albums come when you're in your 20s or even in your teens. And so I'm wondering, was this a project that you were planning on for years, or did it come out of the result of things being a weird time, I guess, as a result of the pandemic?
Well, a little bit of both, because I've always been a frustrated performer, and finding the balance between composition and performing has been a real challenge for me. And so when I have performed, it's tended to be chamber music, because I would just not have the time to prepare full recital programs and the memorization involved. And one of the reasons for that is that when I compose, I'm extremely obsessive. So if I start a piece, I basically can't do or think about anything else except that piece. And I couldn't just interrupt composing a piece to practice Beethoven or Schumann or Busoni or whatever. But I had always wanted to record music other than my own and to record a piano solo CD. So it was something that I was planning for a while. When the lockdown happened, I had just finished 2 commissions, and all of the upcoming commissions were either canceled or put on hold. So I basically had a blank slate in front of me, and that seemed to be the perfect time then. It enabled me to, you know, just practice how I needed hours a day for you know, several months and get the recording done.
So, Lowell, this CD starts with a recording of your most popular piano work, Gargoyles. Now, this is a piece that you wrote in the 1980s, and it's been recorded over 20 times, performed much more widely even than that. So my question is, have you been performing this piece and playing it since you wrote it? And has your interpretation changed over the past 30 some odd years? And if so, do you consider this recording to be the definitive version of this piece?
Well, first of all, I have never played Gargoyles in public. And before I did this recording, I had never learned Gargoyles. And, you know, it's funny because a lot of people assume that you're a composer, you write a piece, and you can automatically just sit down and play it. That is very far from the truth. And in a funny way, when I'm learning my own music, I have to be more careful and systematic about it than when learning someone else's, because you think you know it better than you do. And the intellectual memory of a piece is very different from the muscle memory you need to be able to play a piece. So those two things are very different. So I had never played Gargoyles fully. Of course, I played it while I was composing it and would kind of play through it, but I never learned it. And for me, that was actually the most intimidating piece for me to record and to learn, because there are over 25 recordings of it so far. It is performed literally thousands of times a year. You know, it's a very popular piece with students. I understand it's one of the most popular pieces for piano students in China. But I kind of felt with this recording, if I am going to record some of my own music, a lot of pianists would be very curious to hear how I played gargoyles. You know, you ask if I think it's the definitive recording.
Mm-hmm.
It's the recording that shows, you know, my musical intentions. You know, there are other recordings that certain aspects I would say are better possibly, but I think the whole idea of definitiveness in a performance is an interesting thing, because I have never been a fan of performers who kind of try and put their stamp on a piece and use it as a vehicle to show their personality. I'm interested in the composer, in what the composer was saying and trying to communicate. And of course, in a lot of respects, that's impossible to know. But I think a performer's goal should be to try and get as close to that as they can.
I kind of appreciate that you mention not that a performance becomes definitive in all of its nuts and bolts and details, but in the general ethos of a piece. And so I wonder if you would be able to articulate for us, both in this piece, Gargoyles, and in the opening piece on disc 2, your Apparitions, what that ethos is. Like, what do you hope that performers who want to play your works will take away from your performance of this in kind of broad strokes? What is the character?
I think, first of all, the starting point for any interpretation should be the composer's markings.
Yeah.
It's funny, I remember when I was a student at Juilliard, it was kind of the general feeling that the notes were sacred. I'm not saying with all performers, but it was very common for pianists to think the notes were sacred, and those little hairpins and phrasings and dynamics, those are kind of all up for grabs and to be changed at will to show your own interpretation. And it was really when I was studying at Juilliard with Jacob Lateiner, who was a great Beethoven scholar and pianist. It was the first time it really set in with me the absolute interconnectedness of every element in the score. And in my own music, I try and achieve that. I like to speak of it as an organic unity, that, you know, everything is related. It all grows out of the beginning amount of material. The other thing about my music is that it really is just about the notes and the manipulation of the notes. I've never really been a fan of programmatic music. I never think of anything extra musical when I'm writing music. And you might say, well, but you wrote Gargoyles. It's about gargoyles. I didn't choose the title until I was on the last page of the music, and I had no idea what I was going to call these pieces. You know, I was thinking impromptus doesn't work, preludes, no, songs without words, no. You know, I was going through all the kind of generic titles, and I happened to look down between my legs under the piano where I had these 3 little plaster reproductions of the Notre Dame gargoyles. And I thought, oh, gargoyles, that kind of fits. And the exact same thing happened with the Apparitions. I had no idea what I was going to call these pieces. In an indirect way, they were very much, I think, inspired by the late Brahms piano pieces and that really kind of tight, organic sense that Brahms brings to those pieces. and I couldn't think of a title, and it was actually Stephen Huff who said, "Oh, do you know these two strange Liszt pieces called Apparitions? Maybe that would be a good title." And I thought, Apparitions, I don't know if that quite fits. And then I happened to be reading Leaves of Grass around the same time, and I flipped open the book to a short little 4-line poem called Apparitions. And it just seemed to fit perfectly. And I thought, okay, this is a sign. This is going to be the title.
Let's talk a little bit about the pieces that you've paired with your own compositions. And the name that was extremely new to me on just reading the CD jacket was Miloslav Kabelash. And you have a great story about how you also encountered this composer. So could you just tell us a little bit about this composer and how you found this work and why it became included in your album?
Oh, sure. You know, when I was a student, it was before the internet. And music of obscure composers was sometimes extremely difficult to come by. For example, Busoni. I was always a big Busoni fan. Busoni scores were very difficult to come by, and you would sometimes spend months, if not years, trying to locate a copy of a particular score. So, and of course, that's all different now with IMSLP and, you know, just the availability of the internet. But because of that, there would be a hunger to acquire rare scores, rare music. If you saw something you didn't know, it would be a find. And so I was constantly, you know, going to library sales and going through stacks of music and antique shops and whatnot. And I came across the Kabelach Preludes in the dollar bin at the Juilliard bookstore. And it was a kind of beat up copy that had been sitting on the shelves for years. And I looked at them and I thought, this looks interesting. And I put it on my stack. And when I played through them, I thought they were just absolutely incredible. They're extremely economically written, almost approaching a kind of minimalism in a way, coming very obviously from Janacek. But they're very individual and incredibly expressive and moving pieces.
Piece that I wanted to ask you about is the Busoni Fantasia Contrapuntistica, because on an album that includes the Liszt Totentanz, it's kind of incredible that that's not the centerpiece, you know, most gargantuan pianistic showpiece. This Busoni is like, 25 minutes long. It's sprawling. It's a collection of fugues and introduction and little interludes and all sorts of stuff. How did you come across this piece? Walk us through it. Give us kind of an eagle-eye view of this Busoni piece, because I had never heard of it, and it's amazing.
Well, Busoni was a composer I was introduced to by my first composition teacher at Juilliard, David Diamond, and it was through Busoni's opera, Dr. Faustus, which is just an incredible, incredible piece. And Dr. Faustus and the Fantasia Contrapuntistica are kind of both his musical summations in a way. because there's a lot of interpollination between Busoni pieces. He'll reuse certain things in certain pieces, like the whole introduction from the Fantasia Contrapuntistica is actually the third elegy, slightly rewritten. But Busoni, for me, was always a very fascinating figure and one of the true early experimentalists. You know, there was kind of the famous feud between him and Pfitzner, who was the arch conservative, also a great composer, but of a totally opposing aesthetic bent. And they got into a actually public back and forth when Busoni published his pamphlet on the new aesthetic in music. But I just loved his music. I loved the mysticism. There is always in Busoni's music a profound sense of some kind of search for the meaning of everything. He's one of those composers that almost, it doesn't quite feel right to play it in public. It should kind of be played at 2:00 in the morning on your own, you know. And it was a piece I always wanted to do. In this case, it was also something of a challenge because it is such a monster piece. And it is Busoni's completion of the final unfinished fugue from Bach's Art of the Fugue. But there's a lot added to it. Busoni kind of takes Bach, he takes this music he loves and turns it into his own.
Do you think you'll do this sort of thing again? I mean, you mentioned that it was pretty much, pandemic that kind of created a space for you to actually practice and put in the required time. I mean, I assume that, things are starting to ramp up again and maybe some of your compositions are starting to revive. Do you think you're going to do something like this again?
Yes, I do want to make more recordings. I'm already planning another one. It's a funny stage in my career now because, I do have, as you said before, almost 140 pieces behind me. So it is a sizable catalog. And I don't feel as much pressure to have to compose. I mean, I certainly won't give up composing. But, I think also the realization of turning 60 and what that all means, there's a realization that I want to do certain things that I want to do that I haven't done and allow myself to do that.
Well, we certainly can't wait for more from you. And thank you so much for taking the time to discussing Personal Demons with us. And if you would be so kind, would you mind sticking around to recommend something for our listeners for our classical mixtape segment?
Of course.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Lowell, what do you have for us today?
Well, I'd like to recommend actually the track from my recording that is the Totentanz of Liszt, which has been a piece that I have kind of been obsessed with since the moment I heard it as a teenager. And it's a piece I've always wanted to play, and I still marvel at just the audacity of the opening, which must have been so shocking to audiences when they first heard it. But also, more importantly, the absolute economy that Liszt shows in that piece, where, he gets the most incredible effects, and you think there are zillions of notes. But if you actually look at the writing, it's done with an absolute economy of means, getting the biggest bang for the amount of notes you're playing. So Liszt is a composer who's often maligned, but who I really, really admire.
Well, certainly an excellent recommendation, and Lowell, thank you so much for that and for coming on our show today. All right, Tiffany, what is your mixtape recommendation this week?
Well, I thought I would recommend the only item on my earlier programming exercise for 420 that wouldn't really do that well on an orchestral concert. So here is the first movement of the Ravel Piano Trio in A minor, performed by the Joachim Trio.
So great.
Do you see what I mean by like the smoke in the air? I mean, like, you know, my friend once described this to me as like the perfect like post-coital cigarette in bed kind of.
That's going to be the next programming exercise. Incredible. Excellent, excellent choice. Kensho, what is your mixtape recommendation this week?
So after our talk with Lowell Liebermann, we were kind of chatting around the fact of like what our personal demons in a way of pieces that we're kind of afraid of or something. And I made the flippant comment of having not really that kind of a piece for conducting. But then I was thinking, oh boy, there's so many pieces like that for violin when I was learning. And one of those pieces is by Heinrich Wilhelm Ernst, The Last Rose of Summer. And it's from basically a book of studies, or a set of studies for the solo violin, but it's the title already is scary enough because it's 6 polyphonic studies for solo violin. So the fact that you're playing multiple voices at one time on the solo violin is scary enough. And there's a story attached to this. This performance is by Josef Spacek, who was formerly the concertmaster of the Czech Philharmonic. And there is a very famous practice camp called Meadowmount School of Music that I went to for a number of years to get my butt kicked every summer and practice a lot. And Josef and I think, are the same age, so we were there for, I think, 1 or 2 summers together. And, there are performances each week and whatever, and I, went to this concert. And the first time I heard this piece was when Josef played it for a concert. Never heard the piece, was completely blown away, and then was like, it killed me to know that someone my age was just playing it with such ease, and you just kind of know, okay, so that's a place that I will just never get to with my violin skills. And so it's one of those pieces that I think I don't think I'll ever learn. Maybe I'll try at some point, but it's definitely a personal demon of mine for sure.
Gross.
It's like, how is that possible?
There's 2 people, right?
Well, thank you so much for that recommendation, Kensho. That's a fun one and a daunting one, to be sure. For my recommendation this week, guys, I'm back on my old again. It's been 3 or 4 weeks since I've recommended a French early music hipster. So this time around, it's a violinist by the name of Théotime Langlois de Swart. He has an album out called The Mad Lover, and it's mainly music by the English composer John Eccles, and it's duets. It's Théotime and one of these musicians who I absolutely love, Thomas Dunford, who is actually the partner, the boyfriend of Léa Desandres. And the track that I have chosen from the album is called The Mad Lover. It's a suite, and this is the 5th movement, The Ground. You'll find the links to all of these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Tiffany Liu, and on behalf of Kensho Watanabe and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening, and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.